Hello and welcome to the first session of post-philosophy, number 2, Marx, Laruelle, Irigaray, and Braidotti. Here's Katerina.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm in this big hotel hall, so because I couldn't get decent internet in my cottage house up there, where I am currently for the weekend. So I hope, this echo is not, causing any problem in hearing me. Is it, clear? The sound?
It's a nice effect. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll start just like in the previous semester by reading parts of certain papers, chapters, basically in development of the next book I'm currently working on. It is, in a way, a continuation or development of questions tackled in the previous book on Marx. Those who took the previous course, I guess they will be following easier, but the previous course is not a prerequisite. It's very easy to start from anywhere, basically, of the discussion, because we will be explaining the concepts as we move along. So in this first part of this lecture, I will present the concept of the physical as I believe to be used and understood by Marx. I would argue would be a classical Marxist understanding of the term and use of the term, which is, according to me, essentially post-philosophical or, in fact, non-philosophical. We will be operating more with the term non-philosophical than post-philosophical. It is a presentation of the notion of the physical and of the understanding or the non-philosophical understanding of the material in Marx, in line with such non-philosophical reading of Marx. As you might remember from the previous semester, what I attempted to argue was that, in fact, Marx's own writing is what we would call non-philosophical, but in order to evade any possible falsification of his original doctrine by reducing it to non-philosophy and to Laruelle's interpretation, we resorted to this tentative provisional term post-philosophy, and then stuck with it in the title, of course. So this way of Marx was presented in the previous course, and I will briefly go through of this approach, of the approach of non-philosophy that we will be using here. This approach to this non-philosophical approach to Marx is also called non-Marxism. Laruelle himself produced a reading of Marx that he presented in his book Introduction to Non-Philosophy. There, he explains in a very pedagogical way how come actually he's explicit. It doesn't have to be an interpretation of Laruelle. There are passages in which he explicitly says the following, that the project of non-philosophy, not just non-Marxism, but non-philosophy itself, is in a way a continuation of the original Marxian commitment to step out, to carry out this famous Ausgang, exit from philosophy, which was also Marx's original goal, and which Laruelle argues can be accomplished only by way of not fantasizing that there is such topos, that there is such position, such that would be outside of philosophy without a certain relation to philosophy. So in order to rectify this possible mystification, this possible phantasm of being outside of something, and this being outside of philosophy is what determines my position, and through that I remain attached to philosophy philosophically. Laruelle conversely claims that the only exit from philosophy and of the original commitment of Marx would be the transformation of philosophy into mere material, unorganized material, thought operates with scientifically. So this science that Laruelle argues for is not a mimicry of the proper scientific thought. It's not a mimicry of the exact sciences or the technical sciences or whatever identifies itself as a scientific field nowadays. But first and most of all, without this sort of mimicry, quite to the contrary, he argues for the constitution of a sui generis science with philosophical material that deals with the question of the human, but that is still outside of philosophical humanism and outside of philosophy as a self-sufficient system of thought. So in Introduction to Marxism, Laruelle explicitly says that such is the goal of Marx's original doctrine, that Marx's original project is one of in creating a science on the remnants of philosophy, which in its determination in the last instance seems to be defined by the economic, but the economic itself is merely the material foundation of the society, which is subject to his analysis, so, to Marx's analysis. So the economic he deals with, it is not the same as that of economics, although it provides the scientific foundation for it through political economy. Yet again, in Marx, the goal is to establish such science of society and of humanity, which operates primarily with concepts that are derived from philosophy, but it's still something else, something which is founded itself by way of stepping out of philosophy as self-sufficient universe. So in this arriving to the material determination in the last instance of society that is called foundation, Marx is also, of course, explaining how economics operates in capitalism, but first and foremost, he's providing an epistemological shift toward objective thinking of society, toward form of materialism, but this materialism is one which is essentially non-philosophical. It is non-philosophical for the following reasons. First of all, in spite of Marxism being a doctrine of materialism or historical materialism, if we go to Marx's original texts instead of the subsequent interpretations, we will notice, regardless of the so-called epistemological break in all stages of his thought and writing, we will notice that he shies away from the use of the term materialism, that in the place of where his interpreters would put material, he puts physical or the real. These are the frequent terms we ran into instead of the material, his original doctrine, but the confusing part is the sin which he often rejects the term materialism. Yet again, we know that this is a materialist doctrine, and occasionally he resorts, although very rarely, to the positive use of the term material and materialism. So it wouldn't be wrong, it wouldn't be inaccurate to say that, you know, in line with the more than a century old interpretation of Marx, to say that, of course, it's a form of materialism, but also for the sake of accuracy and fidelity to the original text, also explain, does not endorse the term itself, or he does that very rarely, and very often he has a rather dismissive attitude toward the term. And of course, the reason is that materialism is, according to him, also product of philosophy, according to Marx, of course, also product of philosophy, and in line with his non-philosophical objectives, he resorts to the use of the term real, physical, sensuous very often instead of material and materialism. So I would say that it is materialism without philosophy, or non-philosophical materialism, or simply maybe even non-materialism. That would be the materialism, or the way in which we refer to the notion when we speak of Marx's original text. So I will now go through a presentation of the use of the term physical, and to also argue that physical is the determination in the last instance of the real and of the material in Marx. In fact, what I will argue is that the material beyond the physical is nothing but a philosophical construct. Material beyond the physical would be a philosophical phantasm. So that would be more or less the claim, and I will try to support it with references to Marx's writings. Some of them are given in the reading list, some of them will be referred to here, or maybe it will be best to filter all of them when I send you a draft of what I'm presenting here, because there you will have the exact references for each quotation or so now we will also talk about the construction of subjectivity in Marx, and this construction, this creation, the foundation that Marxism seeks to deal with, or is interested in dealing with, as the determination in the last instance of the self, rather than and that would be what I will call here the non-human. So this realist foundation of the self is the form of subjectivity, Marxism, and also Laruellian interpretation of Marx is interested in. Of course, they both deal with subjectivity proper, with subjectivity insofar as the linguistic category. The two doctrines, in as much as being non-materialistic, doctrines, non-materialistic, or materialist, I'm sorry, let's call them that way, are concerned more with this realist physical foundation, determination of the identity which is subject to analysis, rather than subjectivity as a linguistic category in the narrow sense of the word. The latter is, of course, affirmed as, you know, relevant as such, but not self-sufficient. So that would be the difference with regard to, for example, post-structuralism. In post-structuralism, one is not concerned with the real, because the real is non-transformable into language. So it is useless to language, to the self insofar as a linguistic category, or to subjectivity, and it is outside the field of signification, and it is relegated to the realm of virtual non-existence. Is outside control, which is essentially linguistic. Whereas in Marxism, or in Marx and non-Marxism, if there is not a hierarchy, but a different order of priority, the subjectivity insofar as a linguistic category is affirmed and recognized as relevant and as an instance in its an instance in its own right, an instance of reality in its own right, that can be seen as such, isolated, but its relevance to be viewed in its isolation from the physical and the material is lesser. It's the opposite to the one ascribed to it by post-structuralism. So what Marxism and non-Marxism are concerned with is the understanding, the analysis, the explication of the self insofar as determined as the real or the material, as non-philosophically construed material, or the physical even. The self is in the last instance, to which, in which the linguistic or subjectivity proper participates, but it is not reducible to it. Nor is the case the other way around. In non-philosophy, there is no mutual reduction of anything, you know. Non-philosophy relies on the method of unilateral difference, as Laruelle called it. So I will arrive to the unilateral difference and to the method of dualysis, which is another term for the unilateral difference later on, as I go through the reading. And now I'll start reading this paper, which is an elaboration of what I just presented in this long intro. And as we go along, I will be coming back to the questions I just raised and to the essential references as well. So, first of all, Marx, his project is a one of humanism. This is what he declares. I'm aware of the so-called epistemological, the argument of the so-called epistemological break, but I don't endorse it because unlike the interpretation of the Althusserians, I wouldn't over-philosophize this entire reading of Marx, and so along those lines search for some epistemological breaks. I would go rather with the close, very factual reading of Marx that Michel Henry, for example, undertakes, and in this close factual reading, producing empirical data, I mean, such that derives from the text. One notices that the commitment to certain goals, the commitment to humanism, for example, is a constant in Marx throughout his work. It never ceased to be the declared goal. Although Althusser would like us to believe that there is a certain break, which can be later on called, although even he admits that Marx never called it anti-humanist, but Althusser dared to call it that way. If we are positioned with regard to Marx's text in terms of fidelity to the original text, if we do not over-philosophize by interpreting, if we care about factuality that can be detected in Marx's original text, it would be responsible to say that there is no such break, at least in terms of commitment to humanism. So, is there the commitment to humanism? The commitment to the use of the term physical remains there, instead of material remains there until the end. But I will argue that this humanism can be interpreted non-philosophically, which enables us to call it post-philosophical or post-humanist or even non-humanist. So this is our rendition of Marx's original text on these two concepts, but if we are to be precise with the citing and the reference to the original text, we must note that his commitment to humanism remains called that way, and the interpretation I'm proposing here, which is post-humanist or non-humanist even, is an interpretation. So Marx's humanism is dedicated to reclaiming the human in the last instance, conceptualized as physical. I presented so far. In Marx's original texts, the physical, along with the term real, is used in the same sense in which his interpreters refer to the notion of the material. So I propose the use of the term physical in the sense of material according to Marx's doctrine, and for the following reasons. It's the reasons I just presented, basically, but that's... Oh, and for the following reasons. One, it is the choice of Marx makes himself in his writings, in the early works as in the later ones, almost without an exception, referring to the physical and the real rather than the material throughout the entire opus, and at places in the text that have been referred to as dealing with the argument of the material or materiality by the Marxist-Leninist tradition of interpretation. Material is, as Marx himself has demonstrated, inextricable. I think the critique of Hegel in general, of Hegel's philosophy in general. I love this title, in general. Okay, so this is from the critique of Hegel's philosophy in general. And also, you might know there are such references in other places in German ideology, and also in, okay, that is in the thesis on Feuerbach, but that is also part of that same book. All right, so material is, as Marx himself has demonstrated, inextricable from the materialist philosophical conception of it, of the material. Marx, on the other hand, seeks to create a science of humanity in the remnants of philosophy, as the latter is a form of thought incompatible with a socialist society. So, philosophy is, in a way, a form of thought that is incompatible with a socialist society. This is not something Marx ever said. This is my interpretation. This is a consequence of my interpretation of philosophy and capitalism as the emanation of the same metaphysical foundation. We will arrive to that as the argument moves on. So, therefore, the physical and the real are, in fact, more precise designations for materiality, devoid of any philosophically pre-assigned signification. Materiality, insofar product of philosophical materialism, cannot escape philosophization. The concept does not have any history outside or sense outside of philosophy. So, very often the inertia, the spontaneity of the use of the term keeps us inside of philosophy, because it as such does not have a history outside of philosophy, materialism as such, or materiality. And the question is really, what does materialism or materiality in science's proper mean? And does it have any other meaning beyond physicality, but all right, we will arrive to that as well later on. So, as the very concept does not have any history or sense outside philosophy, including the sciences in their philosophical aspects. The material reality subject to scientific study is in fact the physical reality, regardless of whether living or not. So when we say physical, we do not necessarily means the physical body of the human, and certainly not the romanticized notion of it. So the material reality subject to is in fact the physical reality, regardless of whether living or not. Whereas the abstract idea of materiality escapes representation in scientific languages. So it's not even representable. It's impossible, in fact, to formulate it in a scientific language proper. Materiality as such. So by way of combining François Laruelle's non-philosophy and non-Marxism with Marxist science, we're sketching the contours of a materialist post-philosophy, relying on a non-philosophical concept of the material, one grounded in Marxist understanding of it as the real or the physical. It is a method necessary for the thesis on the non-human we shall propose here. The non-human is the non-philosophical flexion of Haraway's socialist and feminist project, declares it to be, of the post-human she called the cyborg, but also, more recently, the inhuman. She called it inhuman. So, in its foremost but determining theoretical backdrop, it relies on Marx's conception of the human in realist, or in the vocabulary of the Marxist tradition, materialist terms. The term itself, however, originated as part of the so the term non-human, as part of the interpretation of Laruelle's work, more specifically that of John Mularkey, and as formulated in his book from 2015, All Thoughts Are Equal. The notion of the physical we will be using here is therefore taken from Marx as it appears in Marx, and remains unattached to the philosophical romanticizations of the term, including those of the postmodern feminist type. Physical, in the sense used here, is descriptive, as Laruelle calls it. So he speaks of this description as the gesture proper of scientific thinking. So it's not the descriptiveness in the usual sense of the term. It's thoughts correlating with the real, whereby it merely describes the, let's say, the symptoms of the real, reproduces the syntax of the real, as he tentatively calls it, seeks to unveil the laws of this of the operation of the operations of the real, but in doing that, thought merely describes the process. It does not seek to penetrate and own the real, as the philosophical thought desires to do. So physical, in the sense used here, is descriptive, or a clone of the effect of the real, created by a concept and a reality subject of our analysis, according to the method proposed in Laruelle's introduction to non-Marxism. The reality of the human body that is necessarily and unavoidably extended through processes. So when we speak of the human body, when we speak of human physicality, we the presence of the prosthesis, or we presuppose the cyborg. So the physicality we refer to here constantly is in fact that of the cyborg. Than, you know, the purely physical and exclusively organic physical. So the self or subjectivity is the non-human's alien, the self or subjectivity in the sense of language and signification, in the narrow sense of the word, is the non-human's alien yet inalienable inhabitant, the automaton of language. So it's there, it's amidst of this non-human hybrid, yet the hybrid is not reducible to the automaton of language or subjectivity or the subject. So more specifically, in the present analysis, the term physical serves as a clone of the effect of the real or of the constitutive trauma, the real causes of what is subjected to capitalist exploitation and annihilation. And that is the physical world, ranging from the animal, including the human bodies via natural resources, to the sheer physicality of commodities that has been stripped of any value. So all of these forms of the physical world are subject to exploitation and annihilation. So with all of these forms of physicality being subject to this capitalist holocaust, we see the same problem there. The same metaphysical destabilization and making the capitalist universe unsustainable due to this metaphysical falsity. So not due to moralism, not due to sentimentalism, but due to this metaphysical fallacy, that the assumption, the automaton of signification in its aspiration to be self-sufficient and replace the real insofar as physical in the last instance is somehow tenable. So that is the problematic aspect. In through an example with the economic bubble since 2008, and the analysis we offered of this phenomenon in the previous semester, we sort of explained these claims in terms that had nothing to do with sentimentalism or moralism. The explanation was that finance economy proves to be untenable, unsustainable due to its treatment of the real, which always in the last instance destabilizes and makes it untenable, unsustainable, this universe of self-sufficient economic value production or signification automaton. Okay, this was a short detour, but simply to remind those of you who took the previous semester, we are arguing here. So that is the main claim, that there is the main problem with the treatment of the real in both contemporary capitalism and contemporary philosophy. So through commodification, these instances of the real or physicality I presented before have been transformed into value, into pure value, then in surplus value, which in the speculative games of finance industry, for example, unavoidably derealizes the physical. We can also refer to the physicality of commodities, as we said, so objects, buildings, machines, you know, all those defaulted houses during the post-2008 crisis, for example. So to all of them as to materiality, and we can make that reference non-philosophically. That is in line with its function in Marxist political economy. In addition to the material real, there are also real abstractions or abstractions that produce the function of the real, such as money, for example, that are real insofar as they have the effect of a determining exteriority, which is materialized. Okay, I take this term from Davor, who is present here. I borrowed the term determining exteriority from him. During the discussion, I will ask him to present it more closely. I'm referring to a book in the paper. Okay, so these materializations, as a rule, come in the form of trauma. Trauma in the proper psychoanalytic sense of the word. So, cloning of the real would refer to description without philosophy of the sensations that can be conveyed via commonsensical language, so much like Sellers's manifest image of reality, which precedes the foundation for the its scientific reimagination. So it provides the grounds for the emergence of the scientific thought, although merge in utter discontinuity with commonsensical thought. The latter is still the grounds for it. So according to Sellers, the manifest image or the cognitive material common sense is made of provides the possibility for a scientific image of reality to emerge, albeit through a fundamental discontinuity. Parallels between this idea and Immanuel Kant's and François Laruelle's epistemological projects can be established, as Ray Brassier has demonstrated. Seeking to combine Laruelle's non-philosophy and the post-philosophical project of Marx, let us note that Laruelle grounds his methodology of cloning the real precisely in Marx without Marxism. That is, in Marx strip of philosophy. Laruelle terms his own reading of Marx as non-Marxism. This is something we explained at the beginning and also in the previous semester. So, in a first and grounding gesture, non-Marxist thought is rigorously descriptive, attempting to clone the effects of the real, only to arrive to the second movement of establishing a scientific thought operating with philosophical material that has been transcendentally impoverished. By transcendental impoverishment, we mean a Laruellian gesture of producing thought that, in its last instance, departs from philosophically unorganized material. Laruelle calls the ancient Greek term chora or chora, succumbing to the real rather than to the principle of philosophical sufficiency. This is a quotation from Marx. There is one founding theoretical model for the non-philosophical and non-Marxist theory Laruelle proposes, and that model is, in Laruelle's own words, Marxism or Marx without the subsequent philosophization of his texts. Following Marx and Laruelle, I will argue that it is by way of applying scientific rigor upon the empirically assembled data that one can unravel the laws that govern the realities subject to our or any theoretical or scientific investigation without morphing this knowledge into philosophy. Therefore, physical here refers to a reality which is tangible or can produce tangible effects. Physicality itself vouches for an effect of the real, although it is neither reducible to the real nor the same as it. As already noted, this does not mean that the universe of meaning, that is signification and language, does not constitute a real in its own right. As we mentioned before, this is something, for example, Marx himself or some of his interpreters like Henri or Zondrettel have studied so far. So, however, the physical embodiment of the production of signification, the physicality of the subject of language, is the determination in the last instance of its effects of the real. So the effects of the real. Also, the real abstraction is indeed real. Money, wage, market, they are abstractions, but what makes them real are the effects of materialization. So materialization in the way we are using this term here, as I presented at the beginning, post-philosophically, let's call it tentatively so. So what makes them real are the effects of materialization constituting an exteriority to the automaton of signification. So that is what makes them real. They pose a certain limit, a certain outsideness with regard to the automaton of signification, which is subjectivity, or the subjectivity, or the subject in the structuralist and post-structuralist sense. As for the labor force, regardless of whether employed or active or unemployed and dormant, its determination in the last instance is that bundle of brain, muscles, nerves Marx used to write about. And this is a quote from Marx. I think this is this is from the first volume of Capital, where he refers to the first to humanism as the goal of his science, and then when he explains this idea, he explains also the spiritual, or maybe mental, so geistly aspects of the human, but then says that still, yet again, in the last instance, they even these aspects are determined by the bundle of brain, muscles, and nerves. So certain physicality or materiality. To put it differently, the material outside the physical, the material outside the physical, so conceived outside the idea of the physical, is nothing more than a philosophical fantasy, which is something I explained at the beginning. So the physical, on the other hand, can be either organically, so naturally, or synthetically, as technologically produced. So the physical is either of this, and this is why the prosthesis or the technological is not in any relation of exclusivity with regard to the physical. Actually, these are both sources or the foundation of physicality. It can be produced organically or synthetically, regardless. So let us underscore from the onset, technology exists on the purely material plane. So it exists also on the purely material plane, as much as it exists on the purely speculative one, or that of language and signification. So it is as irrational as nature, and it can also make sense as much as any language does. So this mutual exclusiveness and assumed hierarchy between the so-called physical and the technological is false, is one predicated on old philosophical spontaneities, assuming that there is such thing as pure physicality or pure nature and a natural physicality in the sense of this pure nature, and some ex nihilo creation of another form of materiality, which is called technology, and which is assumed to be established on the basis of some radical discontinuity with the physical. So this is an old phantasm, which is a philosophical philosophical phantasm of the possibility of this such dramatic rupture and sublimation thereon. There is no such break between the purely physicality and the technological one. This is a false position. Let's put it that way. So technology has its physical, material, and dumb aspects of physicality, as much as it has it's purely or exclusively, when viewed from that angle, function of signification, signifying in that sense, being a language, a form of a language in itself. So it plays a certain role in the constitution, and it is a continuation of the physical world, just as much as it can operate on the level of pure signification or the signifying automaton, as it can appear on on the level of the physical support, let's say, in the human. But as said at the beginning, the human is, at least in our understanding here, always already taken seen as this cyborg. So the prosthesis is always already assumed. And it is as irrational as the nature. And what I wanted to add was that although it can operate on, and it does operate, of course, on the level of signification or pure signification, one wonders if that can be called rational, and if nature is indeed irrational. So I wonder also if rational or rationalism has also any history outside of philosophy. But that can be debated later on. So it can also make sense as much as any language does. Although making sense does not necessarily means rational. Its speculative capacities are, however, materially or physically enhanced. The material support is endowed with certain immortality compared to the of the purely technological, if possible. So the material support is endowed with immortality compared with the vulnerable bundle of nerves and muscles called the human. So the physical ideal, body, mind, irrational, rational divide is a theological metaphysical myth. Technology is no less irrational and no less physical than the body and nature, whereas the physical and natural are no less rational. Rationalism is, let us underline, an old Enlightenment myth of philosophy. Science does not care about rational and irrational. If an explanation can be produced, if it works, its rationality is less relevant than the fact that there is an explanation. The laws are unveiled and the knowledge is applicable and experimentally provable. And I believe that this has been, from a different angle, successfully demonstrated by works of others recently. For example, in Meillassoux' After Finitude. I believe the claim is pretty similar to this one, although to these conclusions I arrive via Marx and Laruelle. But it's interesting to note that there is a coincidence in the conclusions. So rationalism as such is a fetish and results in a habitus rather than effective change in intellectual history. One that is relevant for either the scientific or the technological development. I think that neither actually care about this value of rationalism. So, the human is materially determined by that. All right, let's not go into analysis of previous claim. We can come back to later in the next class, maybe. Okay, so the human is materially determined by that irrational hybrid of the physical and machine, resulting in no more and no less than the pure body, if such thing is possible beyond mere postulation. Then the pure body is endowed with. So the rational part of it, or the agency of making sense, language, remains outside the materiality of either the body or the machine. It is the automaton of signification or language. Automaton of capital and philosophy is individually substantiated as subjectivity, and more specifically that of the split capitalist self. So the hybrid consisted of the physical and machinic both, so physical in both senses. So the hybrid consisted of the physical, natural and machinic on the one hand, and of the subject of signification on the other hand, is the monstrosity that ultimately escapes sense. So it is inhuman, as Haraway would call it, or non-human, as not Laruelle, but Laruellian interpreters would call it. So it is that inhuman inanity that is neither subject nor merely body, nor just a machine. That is the hybrid we call here tentatively the non-human. So this would be a declination of the post-humanist discussion then. So similarly to Donna Haraway's claim about the radical constructedness of the human as cyborg, Marx argued that sociality, which includes both economic production and the so-called social reproduction, via the means of production, by the way, on the one hand, and physicality on the other hand, constitute the species being of humanity. So the human is radically constructed, yet in the last instance determined by the physical, argue both Haraway and Marx. And Haraway does not only insist that they're both actually determined by the physical in the sense I thus presented. She, in fact, argues that they are in the last instance determined by the physical insofar as this pure, insofar as this organic physicality or animality. She speaks of the animality in this sense. And the cyborg is, in the last instance, determined by the exploitation of the animality. So she also, if you remember, she also argues for something she calls this first between Haraway
Katerina?
and Marx. Yeah?
Okay. Sorry, the last like 1 minute just cut out for me.
Okay.
The last sentence.
How far back do I go? Okay. Did you hear me talking about the Haraway?
Yes,
And
just,
the animality.
yes, just start from.
Okay.
Go back. Just the
So
last sentence. Yeah.
she insists on this continuity between animality and the machining. So her claim is also one about the continuity, and she also points to a certain hierarchy between the two elements in the dyad she's talking about, machinic and the physical. And the physical, so that was the point I was explaining previously. So the physical in her sense is reduced to so to the physical insofar as, you know, bodily, the human body, the animal body, that is. So that's the analogy between the two, the claims of both Haraway and Marx to the construction of the self. So in Marx, instance would be this neither collective nor individual concept of or individualist concept of the species being, yet a hybrid of a sort, which is very similar to the hybrid argues for. That is the cyborg, or what she later called the inhuman. Here, so both of these concepts are referred to previously as radical dyad, the radical dyad. So I will explain now the use of the term radical. It's one indebted in, to the Laruellian interpretation of the notion. So radical in Laruelle would be that insistence on the unilateral difference we talked at the beginning, and now I will present it in more detail. So the notion of the radical is used in its sense, so going to the root of things, but also in the non-philosophical sense of the word, that is in fact not very different from the etymological one. So the dyad is never, so the dyad to constituting the, or resulting into a dyad. Interrelating non-relationally or on the basis of unilateral difference. Something that I will explain now, it won't sound that mystifying. So the dyad is never, so this is why it's called a radical dyad. So the dyad as such never breach reconciling and uniting the two elements, either dialectically or by one to the other, or for that matter in any other way. So there is no unification, there is no an affirmation of a paradox, there is no assumed movement toward possible, even if it's always already failed unity. So no such thing. Merely the lateral positioning of one with respect to the other, whereby one remains radically indifferent to this movement. So, I'll explain it more closely now. So, and this is something we explained in much detail in the previous semester when we talked about dualities and unilateral difference. That was the relation between, or the non-relation, to be more precise, between thought and the real we talked about. So if you remember that aspiration of thought to explain the real, to reflect the real remains radically indifferent to this movement, and the non-philosophical thought sort of departs from this assumed indifference of the real with regard to the pretensions of thought, presupposing that it will either grasp or reflect or disclose in its totality any aspect of the real. It merely seeks to correlate with its effects that can be through this non-philosophical realist movement of thought, but more than that. So this mutual interconditioning of the real and thought, whereby the one reflects the other, that is radically reversed. So not have any form or manifestation possible in this concept of the dyad, where it's so the dyad is never breached by reconciling and uniting the two elements, either dialectically or by reducing the one to the other, or for that matter in any other way. So thought remains unilaterally positioned vis-à-vis the real. It seeks to mediate, while the latter is irrevocably indifferent to any such aspiration. There is neither mirroring, nor reciprocity, nor relationally co-determining one another. So not even by way of paradox. The determination in the last instance is the real of physicality, yet human, yet is the real of physicality. Yet again, the identity of the last instance, borrowed from Laruelle's epistemology, presented in the theory of identities. So, in the last instance, the is that of unsurpassable constructedness. No, wait, sorry. So, it is not reducible to a philosophical truth. So it remains this radical constructedness, but this radical constructedness is not reducible to some truth. And it is not reduced either to physicality or to the truth of physicality. There is no truth in physicality, and there is no truth in the real of the radical hybrid. So the physical, insofar as bodily, non-philosophical materiality of the radical dyad should be viewed in its singularity of a determining occasion, which does not and cannot efface the defining transcendental constructedness of the radical dyad. Laruelle or the cyborg Haraway. So, occasion, which serves as a determination of an occurrence of the real or of an identity, is a Laruellian term that to be analogous to contingency in philosophy, with the occasion is not the opposite of essence or substance, but rather defines the identity in the last instance. Thus, is contingency that acts as necessity. In terms, the identity of the witness, autologically what it is a real in its own right, and it's so far as identity is a irreducible to anything other than what it is. However, it has its own material reality, and that reality is in the last instance determined or occasioned as physical. Haraway's argument for the inhuman, or her proposition of the cyborg, is the product of a feminist and socialist vision of the posthuman, whose Marxian Laruellian declination we have called here the non-human. It is a proposal that takes distance from the philosophical spontaneity of capitalism, that has romantically ontologized technology and automation. So it is the opposite ontologization of technology and automation, assuming that form of romanticization of capitalism. There is no dismissal of either technology of automation. There is what we propose here as a Marxian approach to or automation is philosophical or non-philosophical treatment, either one in terms of the Marxian sense, something which would be close to social or political economic stance of, which does not allow for forms of philosophy, including ontology and so if we are to pursue a vision of either technology or automation, which is Marxian, not left, and socialist, it would not be one of ontology, because it would have to be one of philosophy. And that would be something based on ontology indebted to in this non-philosophical sense, and science rather than philosophy and its efficiency or self-sufficiency. And principle of sufficiency is Marxian Laruellian term as well. So it is also a post-philosophical proposal, this treatment of either technology or automation. It is a post-philosophical proposal due to the fact that it does not produce any form of unification of the two elements of the dyad, insist on such unity's impossibility as a founding paradox. The explanation of the paradox, why do we see it as yet another form of pretension toward unity? The postmodern celebration of paradox is an affirmation of a failure of what should have been there or ideally is, but is never fully accomplished. So it presupposes this unity even when tragically always already failed. Conceived dyad, however, there is asymmetry or hierarchy as the elements are mutually correlationally conditioned. Demonstrated that the physical aspect of the humanist, so not her duality, not the dyad she argues for the humanist dualism, is subject to absolute exploitation, automaton of capitalism, that chain of value production. Cost makes her product about this problem, which is very strangely successfully ignored after techno of the faith in function of technology as something providing almost an automatic okay, so what is at stake here is not only the physical as such and the painful reality of its exploitation, but also the absolute ruse of philosophy being realized, of the real and not only of the physical. Let us reiterate, the physical is the material reality without philosophical materialism. And it is neither reducible nor reduced to the body, but involves its machinic extension as well. So the absolute domination of computation, one among many forms of intelligence, by the way, not the only form of intelligence, of value production comes down to perpetuation of capitalism. Matter is mere resource for value, whereas value is a unit in the self-sufficient exchange system as a signifying chain. This form of cognition, which is one among many and endowed or predicated on historicism or on history, is a epistemic metaphysical foundation, which is specific, or the defining the specific difference or the defining specificity of capitalism and of philosophy, but culminating in the post-enlightenment one. So the absolute domination of computation, one among many forms of intelligence, and automation of value production comes down to the perpetuation of capitalism. So, according to which matter is mere resource for value, whereas value is a unit of the self-sufficient exchange system as a signifying chain. So thus, automation, and this is the only way in which, at least I here speak of automation. I mean, perhaps there are other concepts of automation. I speak of is the automation of the signifying chain in many forms. So, auto production of signification or value. So, thus, the question is the realization of added value and signification production that purports to constitute a self-standing universe, which can dispense with not only the physical as body, but also the real of the non-human hybrid. It has its own reality and posits itself as the real, just as philosophy does. Claim there is a rational core inside materiality or at the heart of the real is to postulate real as truth. In post-structuralist vein, that the real as senselessness is irrelevant comes down to the claim that what counts as really real, or what is the real that counts, is only what makes sense, meaning that justifies and redeems the very being out there of the real. Of thought is the founding gesture of all philosophy, called by Laruelle amphibology of thought and the real. Of amphibology is very similar to that of correlationism raised by Measu. We mentioned this. Let us note that in post-structuralism, although there is a position of the two elements of the classical philosophical equation, real equals fiction, equal to truth, resulting into being, this philosophical entity par excellence, this the being, the amphibology of real and instead of this being the equation, the equation is in post-structuralism reverses, but it remains to be an equation. So now it's fiction equals real. Science, on the other hand, does not care about symmetry. Care if real equals or not fiction, or the other way around. And thus, the hybrid produced of the animal and the machine in its aspect of the real remains senseless, or rather indifferent to sense. Such should be the post-philosophical science of the human too, and more specifically its non-humanist or non-human version. It will not seek to unify sense present in the automation of signification, either in the form of the linguistic self or the computing automaton, on the one hand, as the machine-animal materiality on the other hand. The radical dyad on unilateral of one vis-à-vis the other element between the real and language. The real remains obstinately indifferent to the pretensions of language, whereas the language continues to unilaterally relate to the real, seeking to mediate it. So the non-philosophical posture of thought and language by way of dualities that consists in affirming the unilaterality at issue, submitting to the diktat of the real while operating with the hora of philosophical material. Positioning of thought assumes a posture which is determined as finite and as opposed to phantasm of about automatons in infinity, about automatons' ability to reach infinity, immortality, etc. Investment of some into this notion of logical automaton as such, defined chain. So scientific positioning of thought assumes a different posture, one that is determined and radical, infinite, and dialectics. So this is a quote from Laruelle, from his philosophy and non-philosophy, where he says, we are abandoning the traditional ambitions of philosophy. They are but hallucinations to us, and vindicating finitude, radicality or finitude, the characteristics of scientific posture. So this is a quote from philosophy. I have original, but I believe that the English translation published recently. I don't know how much time we should leave for discussion. I guess 45 minutes. So I will conclude soon, and then we can move to discussing. The real of the radical dyad is precisely that unilateral duality, and insofar as exteriority to the automaton of making sense, it is also material, conceived non-philosophically, of course. So when seeking to determine the material in the last instance as in accordance with the real rather than philosophy, its minimally transcendental clone is the physical. Or inorganic or artificial in its origin. The physical into mere material for the automaton of signification is and substance the same as transforming it into resource for value production, the same as capitalism and the same as philosophy. The materiality of that continuity constituted by the animal, as Rosie Braidotti proposes to do, and should be extended and transformed into a unilateral relation to the real or to sheer materiality of the radical dyad thus explained, of the non-human. Machine and unilaterality positioned, the machine animal and its unilaterally positioned automaton of subjectivity and capitalist. So this is what the dyad is constituted by. So although this is clear because we explained it. And a bit further, so beyond the split subject of capitalism. The affirmation of this dyad or the dyad is the impossibility to bridge the gap between the two is what enables transcendence of the split subject of capitalism, or the split subject, or the split in the subject. No possibility to speak of any split, and that possibility is cancelled from the very beginning, because the unity is never assumed, but not in the way of a postmodern paradox, as we explained before, but in this way of the radical dyad that we also explained. And I will offer some more elaboration now before we continue session. And of course, we will return to this class. So the radical dyad, thus elaborated, is fundamentally different from the split capitalism, as it affirms the grounding heterogeneity, seeking to reconcile the duality in a form of a truth or meaning. The real and what thinks it, naturally positioned, remains in the last instance meaningless. In fact, can be cloned, while thought and the real are not reducible to one another. Philosophy, on the other hand, seeks to reconcile the senseless real with the truth by way of transforming it into truth. So even when you claim there to be you're in a way soothing this realization about of sense through offering some sort of anti-sense or meaning by way of proposing paradox, but there is still a certain countering of the failure of something which should have been there, like this unification and truth by way of constituting a certain sense in the end. So this production of sense is what defines all, and this way of doing it, what defines all philosophy, and it's decisionism, as Laruelle calls it, the radical finitude of science. So the real and what thinks it are unilaterally positioned comes to the radical dyad. So and non-philosophy. So the real remains in the last instance, yet can be cloned into thought, while thought and the real are not reducible to one another. Philosophy, on the other hand, seeks to reconcile the senseless real with the truth by way of transforming it into truth, or hybridizing truth and the real into the being. Entity determined in the last instance by thought. It is the founding concept of all philosophy. So, acts in an analogous materiality is mere material for the creation of values whose first form is commodity. Of the process, to quote Marx, we are faced with the following reality. The value of commodities is the very, this is a quote from first volume of The Capital. So, and he says the following, the value of commodities is the very of the quality of their substance. Not an atom of matter enters into its composition. Atom of matter enters into the composition of commodity. Who alienates his or her labor for a wage divorces it from its coarse materiality. It is an alienation through a second and circular gesture or philosophical gesture. Precisely the radically heterogeneous self is alienated from itself. Being affirmed, the grounding heterogeneity is cancelled by substituting the senseless real it is, truth to reduced and reducible. So the wage worker is from the process of production and reinstituted as abstract labor or void of selfhood and materiality. And here, this is another quote from Marx, but which book? I'll tell you at the end. So he says, economic manuscripts. He says the following: the worker becomes ever more dependent on labor and on a particular, very one-sided machine-like labor at that. He is spiritually and physically to the condition of a machine and from being a man abstract activity, he becomes ever more the fluctuation in market price. This second would be the grounding one of its the objective constitution. Marx. Objectivity instead of subjectivity, foundation on which the materialism he proposes operates with. So the self, with regard to the real, is one among the many objects in the reality. So in a way, it assumes a posture of thought which is similar to that unilateral difference, unilateral difference in the first course, in the first semester, and I also explained here. We find in Laruelle there is the constitution or the thing, so the subject, but he avoids the term subject. So even this constitution of thought, Laruelle would call it thought, even this is considered in terms of, and what is assumed there is that there is certain materiality, physicality, reality in that activity as well, whereby the real, the outsideness, is postulated as objective. So he even shies away from the term subject. It would draw into its logic the problem is self-sufficient thought that Laruelle as a problem to entire philosophy and considers as the problem of philosophy par excellence. Okay, let's not go in the details of such discussion because opening other questions, we can leave it for next time. Let's just comment on this quote. Finish for today. I mean, with my part, then we can continue with discussion. By becoming an and a belly, the worker becomes ever more dependent on every fluctuation of market price. This is what Marx says. So the workings of abstraction as a procedure of ontology with direct political consequences split self that to merciless exploitation. Abstraction at issue and as problematized by Marx is a philosophical reality based on the cancellation of the real by way of substituting with thought of its thought or idea, not problematizing the relevant faculty called abstraction, but the modologization fundamentally they are philosophical and they produce ideology that we are problematizing as abstraction, exempt from material, seeking to instill itself as the only relevant reality. Abstraction of thought that counts and acts in its stead is the object of material economic, philosophical and epistemological critique. Something that which some of his have argued as well, but the longer quote, I think here will be enough time for, and we'll go to this quote and the explanation of how it differs from Hegel as well. All right, so I guess we continue with discussion now. Question?
Yes, we have about 40 minutes. Right, so if anyone wants to jump in, questions or comments. Great, thank you, Katerina. It was really comprehensive. And I'm gonna really have to rewatch this video and get it all. There's a lot to think about. I was wondering, it's kind of a dumb question. I'm kind of just joining this conversation early and learning about this stuff. But how does I guess how would the aesthetic fit into this, to your system?
How does the fit into this?
This relation with the real and
I don't know. I not only have no ideas on this topic, I don't even know enough of Laruelle's actually. Elaborated in the book on non-photography, and many of the aestheticians work with this, and also with the interpretation of Laruelle that Anne-Françoise Schmidt provides. So this line of thinking, it's interesting that this, in fact, in terms of aesthetics, as proposed by Anne-Françoise Schmidt, belong to the more narrow field of epistemology when it comes to. This is an interesting observation, but I'm familiar with these ideas, and you know, art and aesthetics is something which to me when I try to think about them from this angle. So I don't know. I wouldn't know how to comment on this way, but maybe the others here would have some ideas on, you know, how post-philosophical, Marxian, non-philosophical art practice would look like. I wouldn't know exactly. I mean, I would be simply guessing, I guess.
Can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Is it not connected to the question if okay, let me just ask something else, and then I'm gonna link it with this aesthetics question. Could it be that Marx maybe was embarrassed to say that he's a materialist, because if he would have said he's a materialist, it would mean that he himself is part of capitalism, that his theory itself is part of a rendering of a material economic system, so to say. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand, but I think we should sort of trust his own words. And when he says that first with this term, because it has philosophy, I think we should, you know, this cynicism with which he rejects everything which you know, the product of some sort of philosophical spontaneity, like spontaneous philosophical assumption. I mean, he rejects everything which comes from there. And I think I found today a quote. I wonder if I will find it again. I'll try. where he really rejects the materialism, and he clearly says, I do not endorse it because it's philosophical, and it's not and it is not in line with the naturalism. He speaks of naturalism, with the naturalism proposed.
Yeah. Okay.
This is in the critique. Sorry?
No, are you speaking? Or,
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, now I hear.
Never mind. I mean, anyway, I would have to look for found one in this critique of Hegel in general, where he speaks of the possibility of establishing two material, but on two other, so true materialism, which will be completely divorced from the philosophical inheritance behind the term. So there's use of the term, and later on there is complete dismissal of the term itself. It's like and we do not want to have anything to do with materialism, more or less that explicit, and instead for naturalism and realism, two terms. Instead of materialism, we argue for realism and naturalism. That and his problem is with it having no history outside the history of philosophy. He is cautious to identify as such due to this possible misunderstanding that he is a capitalist materialist in that sense. So that's the only reason.
Okay. So
and you wanted to say,
yeah, I was just thinking about this idea, so to say. So that means that materialism, so to say, ends up in some sort of instrumentalism that always relates to efficiency and that always relates to value production, so to say. While physicalism or naturalism is, so to say, the bigger set, right? So materialism is contained in the set of physicalism, of the possibilities of what's physically possible, so to say, what's real. And materialism would be, so to say, the instrumental efficiency, value seeking rendering of reality, so to say. Right? And in that sense, when you transgress materialism, then also philosophy cannot exist anymore, because this is a certain type of rendering of reality. You see what I'm saying? So we have two different sizes of sets of how you can be in relation to the world, so to say. The one set is materialism, which is only one historical realization of the real, while we have the bigger set of the general real, or the general physicality or something like that. And no, and I was just wondering if going beyond capitalism means going beyond materialism, and at the same time also means going beyond philosophy, because we are leaving the one set of relationships and entering, so to say, a higher set or another set of relationships. That was my question. And if that is true, then is the question also if we can still think in humanism terms, and then also we have to think if aesthetics is even possible as we know it today. Because aesthetics as we know it today in art is deeply connected to humanism and the human type of thinking. This is somehow clear what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if this is kind of the train of thought you.
Yeah, it makes No, I understand, but in what way he did not endorse? But I don't what you initially with the questions, but I don't think that this sort of qualities of materialist thought, etc., were something automatically assumed. Something related with materialist thinking, with materialism as such, in the epoch when Marx, in Marx's epoch, in Marx's times. It's interesting that all of these consequences, that materialism is this type of intelligence, produces this type of intelligence or thought. It's interesting that we have these consequences as consequences of it being essentially philosophical. So maybe that's interesting. It's unequivocally is that the problem with it is the problem of it being too philosophical. Now, being too philosophical, it's what's the problem there? The problem there is precisely the problem of philosophy's sufficiency. And those were the quotes I was looking for actually before. The problem of philosophy's sufficiency, the problem of so it's functioning as the of sufficient. It's decisionism, it's amphibology between the real and thought. All of this, you understood this because you're half Croat. I said znači. So all of these aspects are of philosophy, as defining aspects of philosophy, are pointed out to as the problem Marx has with philosophy as such by Marx himself, but in different terms, using different terminology. I just borrowed Laruelle's terminology. He uses a different one, but practically saying the same thing. Find those quotes illustrate that is what he sees as problematic. This tension to postulate reality and substitute reality as such, that it's post of the real is endowed with the pretension to be more real than the real itself, and as the founding falsity of every philosophical gesture. All of these things are pointed out to, and also the problem of abstraction. So he identifies as the grounding principle of all philosophy and of capitalism. So this is in Marx the grounding, so the definition of both philosophy. So the problem of alienation or abstraction, and as he explains here in the critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, and in Feuerbach, and in other places in German ideology, of course not the cognitive capacity, he uses a different term, the cognitive capacity of abstraction, but this pretension of the abstract thought to postulate the real instead of the real itself. Okay, let's say that, for example, instead of all these terms that I'm using currently, and I'm borrowing from Laruelle. He speaks of this issue of subjectivity versus the objective. Explained during the lecture. Or is man coming to himself? The only labor knows and recognizes is abstractly mental labor. Therefore, that which constitutes the essence of philosophy, here he says it, the essence of philosophy. And that, this is a quote from Hegel's philosophy. Hegel's philosophy. So let us provisionally say just this much in advance. Hegel's standpoint is that of modern political economy. So first we affirm this contribution in Hegel, and then Hegel is being problematized. So he grasps labor as the essence of man, as man's essence, which stands the test. He sees only the positive, not the negative side of labor. Now, labor is man's coming to be for himself, within alienation or as alienated man. The only labor which Hegel knows and recognizes is abstractly mental labor. Therefore, this is familiar, this part I just read. I'm reading it because of the quote, because of the next sentence. So, therefore, that which constitutes the essence of philosophy, the alienation of man who knows himself, or alienated science thinking itself. So the circularity is the problem, not the cognitive capacity of abstraction and alienation. For example, if we posit that everything is objective, we affirm the grounding abstraction. We are grounding our thinking and being in abstraction. Abstraction pertaining to capitalism, and the one which is a reflection of the problem of philosophy as a whole, is this second gesture of abstraction he calls alienation, whereby alienated science thinking itself posits itself as the only reality. So in a way, it's not in a way, it's literally so. So he points out the same problems with philosophy as Laruelle does. Hegel grasps as its essence, and in contradistinction to previous philosophy, he is therefore able to combine its separate aspects. But okay, this is not the part about objectivity. That's the most interesting. Wait, let me find it. So, yeah, about nature and.
We have. Sorry, we can move this.
Let's move.
Conversation.
Okay, let's move
to the classroom, and that would actually be great.
Okay.
For the classroom. I think Jacob has a question next.
Okay.
Yeah, so kind of still in the realm of aesthetics. I'm wondering if we could suggest that there might be an aesthetic real that we're alienated from. So an aesthetic that is withdrawn from subjectivity and anthropology. So I'm thinking about this through something like Deleuze's aesthetics, where aesthetics are intensive or affective sensation, rather than meaningful as we might generally think about aesthetics. I'm not sure how to frame this in non-philosophical terms, but it's kind of what I'm thinking through in this discussion.
Well, non-philosophically speaking, I mean, if speaking, the real remains to Lacanians, to Lacan's theory, the real remains foreclosed to thought, so it's inaccessible. But post-structuralist treatment of the real, whereby the real is relegated to the realm of non-existence, accessibility, because we are fully accessible. This claim, Euclidean treatment of, let's say, the Lacanian, argues for thoughts correlating with the real, but the real and thought constitute this radical dyad I was presenting at the beginning. They are not, they remain in this relation of unilaterality with one another, so non-relation. That is to say, so the real cannot simply to thought and be by it, and thought cannot. Thought is fundamentally different from the real. It constantly correlates with it. It succumbs to it. It sort of submits to it, to being determined by it, but it still remains radically something different from the real. So this would be the non-philosophical treatment of the real, and it might have some more aesthetics as well. So this would be an aesthetics which affirms the inaccessibility in the last instance, the foreclosure, the grounding for foreclosure of the real, while still succumbing to the effect of the real in this from it. I guess it would be an aesthetics which is based on thought, which departs from its radical sovereignty, its unilateral difference from the real, so it being the field of signification, of sign or value or meaning production, radically independent from the real, yet constantly submitted to its effects. So the realism in that sense of the word, I guess. I don't know how it would materialize itself, perhaps, as you suggested, through, I don't know, submitting to sensations, to other effects of materiality, as you suggested. It might relate to what Deleuze would argue, as you suggested, which wouldn't be, considering how indebted, to which extent Laruelle's non-philosophy is indebted to Deleuze. So perhaps it's there, but some relation with to Deleuze, but I wouldn't know more than that.
Can I say something?
Anna?
Yeah, sorry. Just about Laruelle's aesthetic project and its relationship to Deleuze, and this is just a rehashing of Laruelle's books on non-standard aesthetics, and to kind of go back to the earlier query, do we need a different kind of aesthetics in this sort of post-philosophical world? I think Laruelle's answer is the non-standard aesthetic project, right? And the problem with Deleuzian affects, right? Because art for Deleuze produces affects and percepts through this interaction with the plane of composition, right? So I think for Laruelle, he makes it pretty clear that that's a transcendental step that he wouldn't take. So for Laruelle, right, art doesn't produce things. Art is art, and art is a clone of the real. of the real as art, right? So what, like the affective aspect is part of the materiality that's indexed in the production of the art, and the human is also part of producing the work of art as material, and it's the human, you're trying to get at the human and human with it, right? So the affect is another way of talking about art as representational or interpretable, and that's something Laruelle really wants to get away from in his talk about art. So I think it's Galloway puts it is sort of on the nose and saying like the aesthetics of Laruelle doesn't produce thoughts about art. It produces, art thought. I'm maybe a little more skeptical of that formulation, but for Deleuze is still doing thoughts about art in his whole system of, affects and percepts and the relationship between chaos and the plane of composition, which is a transcendental move, right, to insert thought in between the work of art and its production and chaos, right? And so non-standard aesthetics doesn't make those moves and take those positions. So what you get out of the non-standard work of art is a clone. That's what I would say about very short interpretation. So you get out of the realm of having to talk about art both affectively and conceptually, and you move beyond that in non-standard aesthetics. That's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just some readings if you want for the next class, which come from non-aesthetics, maybe she's more familiar. The non-standard aesthetics project. I mean, any of you can suggest something which can enrich the list in that sense. As you can see, what I have proposed is more political and more economic and more in line with Marxian, but we can, of course, open these questions next classes. So, anything else?
Where is your list, Katerina, or have you not sent it out yet?
I did send it. I think that, everything is in this Facebook group and they posted it there. But I don't know if they have sent it. I did not have the addresses of the groups of the students, of you, so I couldn't send anything. I mean, I usually don't. It's usually the people from the center group or the lists. Anyway, the list, beginning of this month. No, even since the end of April. I think it's also posted in this Facebook group, the Facebook event, but you're not on Facebook, so.
No.
Yeah, I could send it to you if you like. Maybe I'll just forward it after class, just whatever on Facebook.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, Davor?
Can I just one question? So I remember you said automation. You called a chain of signification or signification chain.
Mm-hmm.
What is binding this chain of significance? So there's some sort of purpose, and we have, and in this purpose we have two kinds of purposes. We have the internal purpose of the robot or whatever, of the technical function, and the purpose that produces the robot, right? You see what I'm saying? So we have two layers of purpose.
No, there is.
No. Okay.
No, it wasn't related to purpose. The point was that, there is materiality when we talk about technology, and there is the level of signification or sign production, just as are these two levels in physicality proper or physicality insofar as organicity, as you know, the physicality in that sense of the word. So I'm using the word automaton, the only way in which I know and I am able to understand it and use it. For the sake of simplicity, I will say that it comes down to the automaton we find in Lacan's work. So in Lacan we have pihe, the blow, the incidence or the accident, the real is, and this blow, what the real comes down to, the effect of the real is something which makes no sense. So like in the real in a Lacanian sense of the word. And so the real here is equate, or the other name for the real is this incidence. So that's the real, and that's the these are the two terms we find in Lacan. The other term is the automaton, and the automaton is the operation of language, which is also called the pleasure principle. So this is an endless principle. You know, this sign production, the signification, the operation of language, you know, constant producing of meaning, and also of pleasure, which is the product of meaning as well, of phantasm, the imaginary, etc., etc. Pure trauma, or the pure real is just trauma and nothing else. So the automaton in this sense of the word, as we find it in Lacan, meaning the signifying chain, workings of the signifying chain as signification production, and as pleasure principle, is actually the automaton of language. And in Lacanian sense, so he also calls this automaton also language. So this is not my interpretation. So this signifying automaton is the language, literally, in Lacan. So building on this argument and so shifting it non-philosophically, so producing a certain non-philosophical use of this concepts, this theory, I'm just proposing a more generic rendition of the same notion of automaton or the signifying chain we find in Lacan, which is simply language more generally, language not just more generally or in the generic sense as more generally as we would find it in Lacan, like langage, but literally language in the linguistic sense of the word, like in the sense of rationalist linguistics, then in the sense of computing languages, also it is the same concept of signifying auto production. So it's the same, it's the logic of language. So this is why the way I treat and use the term automaton is literally in the sense of the signifying chain. It comes down to the sense of language in this generic use of the term. So language as in Lacan, language as in Laruelle, and language as in linguistics, and language as in computing. So automaton in this sense. Automaton is really nothing but the automation of signification. self-production, reproduction of signification. It excludes the machine in its physical robust sense. So if we are to be precise with the use of the term automaton, we should not automatically equate it with the machine, because even in these technological terms, the machine in its robust physicality is not the same as automaton, whereas automaton is really this, and there is difference from the natural languages, from computing languages, or from the or from the exchange system of capitalism. The automaton of exchange and value production. There is no difference between the instantiations, the realities of these forms of automation. They are literally, formally the same. The only difference among all of them is actually the physical support is provided by, I don't know, technology. The other is provided by the human body, and I don't know, third is the real abstraction of capitalism. So this is it is in this sense that I use the word automaton.
Okay, can I rephrase it then for a second? But still, what I meant before with purpose, you can also call now syntax, right? Where does this come from? So I have this chain of significations and so on, and they're somehow bound together. They're somehow, linked together in some. So we are building an entity or a form or an object or something like this. So where does this come from? What is the source of the syntax? The automaton.
The automaton is a self-sufficient universe. It cannot be anything else, even in non-philosophy. Yet there are two ways to position the automaton vis-a-vis the real. The first way would be the philosophical, whereby the automaton acts as if the real wasn't there. It is endowed with the pretension to engulf the real, to replace it, to be the only real there is. So the only real there is would be pure meaning, like Hegel's idea being fully realized. So teleology fully accomplished. That would be the culmination of positioning of this automaton vis-a-vis the real. The non-philosophical positioning is one which is sort of aware of its isolation from the real, which is aware of the foreclosure of the real and its inaccessibility in the last instance, but it succumbs to the effects of the real. And in this passivity with regard to the real, it clones its effects. And Lacanian automaton of sign production succumbs to the traumas of the trauma proposed by the real, and it sort of rearranges itself according to these traumatic effects of the real. Now, these traumatic effects, which sort of invite this reorganization of signification, these effects when these effects cloned automaton of signification, this would be the syntax of the real, so-called, tentatively called so, almost metaphorically, because the real proper does not. What we have can detect a sort of syntax would be these effects, these traumatic effects, which sort of invite a reorganization of signification. So some.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
This is a presentation of, sorry, just to explain briefly, presentation of the concept as it appears in two places, this syntax of the, in two places I remember, in Laruelle, in non-philosophy, philosophy and non-philosophy, and introduction to non-Marxism. So my rendition of those places in the text.
So I'm just doing a time check. We did start about like 8 minutes late. So if you'd like to go for just a little bit longer, it's up to you, or we could finish now, but it'd be good to just touch on maybe what the expectations are in like the following classes, and what maybe like what the direction of this seminar will be.
Sorry, I didn't hear this.
Oh, sorry.
Breaking.
Just the direction of the next classes, and Anna proposed maybe some like aesthetic reading, maybe like taking a little bit of a detour there. Just curious about like where you see this going in following classes.
Well, I will propose this aesthetic. I mean, these readings which are relevant for aesthetics. Standard aesthetics, but as I said, it's not my field, first of all. Second, that's not, you know, the concept of, so the course will go in the direction as presented initially, and it will be more, you know, of a political economic analysis of the concepts of automation, of this this critique of ontologization of technology, etc., etc. Most of the questions I raised here will be be part of the next discussions as well. And to that, I will also add some, you know, readings from aesthetics, but it's not part of this course. I mean, it's really not.
That makes sense. Yes. So, just before we finish off, are there any readings specifically for next week that maybe you could assign, or if you're going to send those?
I mean, there are those readings that I suggested. They are for this and next week. I'm not sure how many readings I should suggest by, you know, on a weekly basis. If I remember correctly, from, you know, the previous courses, I suggested are, you know, sufficient, at least for 2 classes. Anyway, next week we will continue with Marx, with Laruelle, with from Marx maybe more from Grundrisse. He sort of touches upon the question of automation more directly, although I do argue that, you know, the exchange system, the value production in the exchange system is the same automation we find in technology, for example, and in language, etc., etc. We can go back to those questions. But so where he refers to technology in the more, you know, narrow classical sense of the word, and if we and we will, of course, because that's the concept for next class. And considering that we will be treating, exchange system or the system of value. I mean, this is the exchange. What is being exchanged are values, and its treatment as automaton in this sense of the word, and which is, I argue, very similar to the linguistic understanding of signification as well, or signifying automaton. As this will be the argument we will be pursuing further, I guess the best thing, the best source on the subject would be certain parts from the third volume of the Capital. I can suggest those and add to the list. So in addition to what is there already, I can also suggest, and I think Runtrisa is there, I can also suggest the parts in the course of next week, the parts from the third volume of Capital. And okay, the non-standard aesthetics, we said that. And yeah, from the proposed list, we will leave out for the time being Irigaray, Braidotti, and Irigaray. We will leave them for the last two. So for the last two classes, for the first part, those readings from Marx I proposed. Plus, I will send you the suggested parts from the third volume of the Capital. So that will be the only addition to the list this week.
All right, great.
And that will be, it will cover this treatment of, automaton as exchange system of value and as perfectly analogous to language in the linguistic sense of the word.
Cool. So if there's anything else, or I think we're at time, we could just end right here. Okay.